Hey. Fever. Hi everyone, and welcome back to this week's Remind podcast. My name's David Masterton and I'm joined by Dr. Ashleigh Moreland, and today we are going to do a little bit of a carry-on from last week's episode about kids' behaviours, challenging versus not challenging versus acceptable for different things. Like it's just like a really big sort of topic that we're going to cover over 2 weeks. And last week we spoke about, okay, is behaviour for the child challenging, or is it the parent's ability to cope with that behaviour and teach through it? Versus this week we're going to talk more about really big, maybe sort of, behaviours that are sort of outside of that scope, and sort of more about, okay, there are some limits that we need to draw, and then looking at how and why the kid might be doing it, and just sort of talking about that, really. So over to you, Ash. Give us some insights as to some examples.
This is really big for me. I can feel the energy of it because my first child was pretty typically developing for the first 12 months of his life. Mm-hmm. And after he had his 12-month immunizations, he regressed in just about every aspect, and particularly emotionally, behaviorally, but developmentally, even language and the way he was playing, his motor skills regressed. And I thought I was going crazy at the time because I didn't really understand that, anything like that could have happened. I took him to the doctor, and the doctor's like, oh no, boys will be boys and it's normal for those kinds of behaviors. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not normal for my kid.
Yeah.
I've had a kid who was like this for a year, and now he's like this, and he's like a different kid. It's not normal for my kid. And so I sort of feel like I got this drastic, throw a bucket of ice cold water in someone's face moment of a taste of behaviors that weren't normal, because I had 12 months of what my son was like, and then literally over the space of days he was not like that anymore. And the behaviors were quite extreme. Like, he went from sleeping 12 hours a night straight through to screaming for 2 hours before he'd go to sleep, and then waking 8 or 9 times every single night.
Jeez.
He became really violent. He would self-harm. He was hospitalized multiple times with concussions from smacking his head repeatedly into concrete.
Ooh.
His speech regressed. He regressed in just about every imaginable way. And I kind of learned pretty quickly that I wasn't going to get answers from doctors and pediatricians and specialists, because they all just kind of made out like I was a crazy mum and making something out of nothing. So I was really fortunate that I was doing my PhD in neuroplasticity at the time. I understood literature, like I could read scientific literature. That was part of my professional training. So I really, really started to deep dive into scientific literature, trying to understand essentially what was driving these crazy behaviors in my child that just were not consistent with the kid that I used to have. So it opened up a whole Pandora's box, I guess, for our family, because there was major emotional dysregulation in him. There was obviously cognitive decline, speech decline. It was almost sleep disturbances. There was changes in his motor behaviors. There were physical issues. He started developing eczema. He started having respiratory issues. He became super sensory sensitive. So tags, he had to cut tags off clothes. He couldn't wear hats or beanies or hoods anymore. He became really funny about textures of clothes. He started getting a lot of repetitive behaviors as well. The aggressive outbursts were, like I said, whether it was self-harm or outward towards others or property damage, extreme, right? And so
Wow.
I started to really question what the hell happened to my kid. The behaviors are not okay. They're not normal. And what was driving this? So over a period of about 5 years, I started really peeling back the surface in this, and I took him to a whole heap of natural practitioners and naturopaths and gosh, just about everyone you can imagine. I'm going to focus on the things that probably had the biggest impact on him because he now, the age that he is, he's 11 at the time of recording this, is for the most part a typically developing 11-year-old. He's in a mainstream school. He does pretty well. He has moments where these symptoms might display, but for the most part, he's a happy, healthy kid. So what happened to go from typical developing to this issue? And then how do we get from that issue back to being able to be a functional human again? The biggest things, what I learned is that there is a neuroimmune response. So what happened in his particular case, I believe, is that maybe he might have had a little bit of a virus or there was something not right in his immune system at the time that he got his vaccinations. And so his immune system had this raging response to the vaccine and actually caused inflammation in his brain. Now, if you go to, Google or even ChatGPT and look up what are the symptoms of brain inflammation or what are the behaviors that show brain inflammation, it's going to tell you all of those things. It's going to say mood and emotional issues, cognitive issues, fatigue and physical issues, sleep issues, changes in social behaviors, sensory challenges. It's going to say all of those things. Now, obviously, what else do those things sound like? It sounds like autism spectrum disorder.
Yep.
So he does have that label. He does have, and I call it the whole D soup. But fundamentally, it did come down to, well, what are some, if we now understand that if an inflamed brain results in altered behavior, what can cause inflammation in the brain? Number one, in his case, immune reactions. So sometimes I've had other people, since I've spoken up about this, I've had other people come forward and go, oh my gosh, Ash, I thought I was crazy because I swear that my child was typically developing until he got a virus or until this happened or until that happened. And it's almost like there's an onset of these symptoms that then became consistent with ASD or some other neurodivergence issue. So the immune reaction, there's things called PANS or PANDAS. So PANS is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome, or PANDAS is basically PANS, but it's associated with a strep infection, a streptococcal infection.
Okay.
They are really, really common. So if you have children who are demonstrating some of these really, really troubling behaviors, these are some doors that I'm trying to open for you in this conversation, right? So go and explore PANS, go and explore PANDAS, consider those immune reactions. Another thing is that food sensitivities, food intolerances, food allergies is a really big one to consider, because also what happens is when our immune system has that response, that as well as we're exposed to a whole heap of toxins in our environment, from our water supply to our food to our, bubble bath that we use, our washing powder that we use, our cleaning products, that can actually damage, through a toxic load, it can damage the lining of the gut.
Gotcha.
And so if you imagine that the gut's like a big giant net, things that net would normally contain so that it's not crossing the blood-brain barrier.
Seeps through, yeah.
Exactly. It starts to seep through. And so the chemicals that normally would be nicely contained in the gut and just processed, now are seeping through, crossing the blood-brain barrier and affecting, like basically causing that brain inflammation. So environmental toxins, there's like heavy metals, pesticides, there's all these kinds of things that can cause these inflammatory responses. And the one that I focus most on now is chronic stress and trauma. So there's a really, really big kind of debate now in going, oh, well, is ADHD actually ADHD, or is it undiagnosed trauma or untreated trauma? Because the symptoms of them overlap. But I would argue that actually both trauma and ADHD is ultimately pointing to inflammation of the brain. So the conversation shouldn't be, well, do we treat the trauma, or do we treat the ADHD? Do we do this? Do we do that? Why don't we just go, how do we reduce the inflammation in the brain? That's the logical conversation for me.
Oh, yeah. And,
I just did a lot of talking, but
you did. But I want that
sums it all up.
inflammation in the brain, the biggest inflammator, the silent one is sugar, carbs. When you have too much of it, I've heard, again, not a doctor, don't see me, bro, is that it will do it. Now, I know these things. Do I stay away from sugar? Not at the moment. But that can be it. But I like the fact that what we're talking about is being curious about it being something else. So, yes, neurodivergence is a big one because it's becoming a lot more accepted. And I think the guidelines of how, because I think everyone displays some traits of neurodiversity. However, to have the label, you have to have more of them than not. So,
yeah.
So being curious to that, or other things, like as you were talking, it reminded me of a time when my eldest daughter was like 2 or 3, 2.5, something like that, like really, really small, but she would be watching her iPad or something like that. And I would ask her to turn it off. And at a decent level. Say it louder, turn it off. Yeah. She wouldn't listen. So my instinct was that she wasn't listening to me because she's too focused on the technology. So angry dad appears very quickly out of thin air. And then and she would get really upset and then say, I'm sorry. And I'm like, well, if you're sorry, listen to me the first time. Why do I have to ask you 3 times? And yeah. I thought, because, again, what I would do as a kid is just not listen, pretend not to hear, until it was like, how committed are you to me not doing this? So I project that onto the situation and think she's doing the same thing. Long story short, turns out there was actually an issue with her hearing. Her hearing was blocked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And my God, how shit do you think I felt after hearing that?
Yeah.
Okay, literally, it wasn't what I thought it was. It was something completely different. And so I think a really big takeaway for me in this episode would be, don't put all your eggs in one basket of what you need it to be. Do you always need it to be a teaching moment? Because for me, in the past, it always had to be a teaching moment. If your kid's not doing it, it's because they're just pushing back on you because they're just trying to win the situation. Versus it could be something else, right? And I know other people who always want to put it down to some label. The behaviour can be easily explained away because of this label, that label. Okay, right? We're talking now 2 very different extreme ends of a spectrum. So if you can come at it and not have a preference as to what it is, and then be curious to it's one or the other or both, then you're on the right track. So it could be you're missing something. Okay, I've been teaching, but we're not getting anywhere. Is that because the unwinding is going to take longer than a couple of teachable moments, which it could be, especially if you've come into someone that's, had to have a pattern of behavior over many, 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 many years? Or is it that plus something else? which teaching moments
Yeah.
alone won't help. So some understanding, change of this, get out and move. ADHD, interesting about the inflammation, but I would say for my son who's been diagnosed with ADHD, the use of Ritalin has really helped him slow down and get more in touch with his emotions. But it's not something that we see as the fix. It's a tool for the moment to be able to explore, because his baseline when we take him off is steadily getting higher. And when I say high, he's becoming a lot more settled himself, even though he may have moments of, Energizer Bunny, which just makes me tired even thinking about it.
That is also because he is getting older, right? And
Yep.
so as he's getting older, his brain is still developing.
Well, he's 9, so, he's got a little way to go. But yeah, exactly. So being curious as to what are the things. So big physical outbursts, not listening, I suppose yelling back. I think just like the not listening or challenging authority, I think is a massive one. Like you can take that up to teenagers. Like I don't have teenage kids yet. Looking forward to it. But it would be I'm not listening to you. Who are you? I hate you. Blah, 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 blah. That would be difficult, but it's they're not listening to you. So how then do we look at that? Could we have teachable moments, or do we need to think that there's something else going on? But I think open communication is going to be important. And then we've got hormones. Like how the hell do you cope with hormones when you're a kid? Like I remember having hormones. I don't remember what I was like towards my parents when I had hormones, because, very self-centered.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
There's always something.
It's so complex.
The joys of being a parent.
Yeah, 100%.
It's all worth it.
Does the conversation then go to, well, what do we do about it? So when, I shared a whole heap about neuroinflammation, about the behaviors you might see. And for me as a parent now, so obviously my focus is on mind-body well-being. A lot of my work is around regulating the nervous system from resolving chronic stress and trauma. But we can't deny the importance of all of these other things. We have a whole entire episode of what are some other factors contributing to nervous system dysregulation, where I touch on some of this stuff. But for a parent really wanting to understand this from how do I support my child, my friend, if you are listening to this, my heart goes out to you, because it is not easy. And the road, there's one of two things. One, you can put your head in the sand and go, nah, it's all too hard. I'm just going to leave it and we'll just push through. Understand that even if you do that, the potential for the damage to your child's emotional and relational development is very likely. So for me, I always sort of looked at it and went, okay, choose your hard, because it's going to be bloody hard to go down the path of these interventions. But is that hard? What's on the other side of the hard? Because it's going to be hard to continue to live like this and to push through this. And on the other side of that hard is a kid who believes that he's bad, that he's a bad kid, he's a naughty kid, he can't do anything right, he's rejected, he's not loved, that's on the other side of that hard. Or we can do the version of hard that is looking at some of these interventions. It's really actually implementing some big changes. Yes, they're hard to implement, but do you know what's on the other side of that hard? A kid who learns that actually these behaviors are not him. It was a product of his brain that was on fire, and he was worthy of our support, that we loved him, that we supported him, that we nurtured him, that we were willing to do hard things in order to support him to have a healthier, more fulfilling life, right? So that requires a certain level of capacity. Totally, I hear that. But the biggest things that made a difference to us was, number one, reducing environmental toxins. So in our home, we use Dermavine is the product of like soaps and shampoo and all that sort of stuff that we use. We used to be really, really chemical free, including like our dishwashing liquid and absolutely everything. I use normal dishwashing liquid now and my kids are fine because their body has processed a huge chemical load and they can process what's there. So we're really, really careful about environmental toxins and chemicals in our home. The next thing I would say is consider the RPA hospital actually has a food chemical elimination diet, and that was game changing for us. So there is a book called Friendly Foods, which is available. I just bought it from like Big W or Target or somewhere. So just look up Friendly Foods. That's a book by the allergy unit at the RPA hospital, and it's all about understanding the effects of the essentially inflammation or those chemicals passing through to affect the brain on kids' behaviour. So we followed the protocol doing the food chemical elimination diet, and I got my kid back. Like, it was night and day. So to give you an example, I kept a very, very detailed food and symptom diary for that time. I remember challenging the preservative sorbate, which was just like half a cup of lemonade with sorbates in it. And within 10 minutes of having sorbates, my kid went from being able to enunciate words fine to really having language difficulties. So he couldn't pronounce water. He would say war. He couldn't say daddy. He would say day. And that was literally within 10 minutes of having sorbates. So for every single chemical that we challenged, we had a very, very clear picture of what was the dose that his brain, like that was too much for his brain, what were the behavioural signs and symptoms or his sleep or whatever, how long did it last before we kind of got him back, before he was back to kind of his happy, healthy self again. So that was life-changing for us. And then once we worked out what the challenging food chemicals were that were most affecting his brain and therefore his behaviour, we then got to work on supporting the healing of his gut. Out of all of the things that I tried, the most successful was a protocol called the Nemetschek protocol. It's all about regulating the autonomic nervous system. So that was chicory root inulin, which is a prebiotic. It was a very high quality olive oil in a very specific dose, and a very, very, very specific dose and ratio of fish oils to support healing his brain and his gut integrity. We did that. I think, what else? I would say it's definitely worthwhile seeking testing for PANS or PANDAS. Partly because if it's PANDAS particularly, the treatment is literally a type of antibiotics, a really, really specific type of antibiotics, or they'll do an immunomodulatory therapy. And then literally the difference in a kid pre-treatment versus post is night and day. So that is absolutely life-changing as well. And then obviously I've banged on about this long enough, we're at like episode 88 or something by this point. Parents, regulate your nervous system. That honestly, because brain inflammation is a form of dysregulation. Anytime you as the caregiver is signaling a threat response to your child, their brain has to respond with dysregulation to respond to that threat. So by us regulating our nervous system, that's actually going to support our children's nervous system to, anchor into safety. And when their nervous system is receiving the signal of safety, that's when it starts to regulate and those behaviours can start to dissipate. So I've just thrown a ton of information at you, and my prayer and hope is that this information finds the people, from my own lived experience and my professional experience, that this information finds the people who are in over their head, who feel absolutely desperate and lost and don't know where to turn to, because I am sorry, but the pediatricians have never been taught this. They don't know it. And it's not their fault that they don't know it. they have just never been taught it. So that is 10 years of my life all wrapped up in a box with a bow on it. Here's all the best of the best information that changed our lives, and my prayer is that it changes yours too.
Yeah. And look, I think it's just about, as well, not being dogmatic about where the problem comes from. So being able to go, all right, you know, I have a preference, or I don't feel as I have a preference, but generally you will have a preference on what you believe it is. Be curious to, if it's not that, what do you fear the most it could be? Research that. Then come back and then try and work it out. But yes, if it's not environmental, and parents, you're the biggest contributor to environmental for a child that lives with you, then be open to other things. Like it could be physical, like a short-term physical, like blocked ears, or it could be something neurological, like neurodiversity, or it could be, as you said, an environmental, but it's actually a toxic load that's coming in and affecting the brain that then needs to be detoxed so it can come back to a sort of better homeostasis. Like it feels like it's back in your body a little bit more. So that's, if you're watching this, you're on the path anyway, but it wouldn't be easy. But I'd say with, Ash's 10 years of experience just on that, wowzers, that's gold. But my biggest thing is please don't just stick to one thing, whether you think it is or not, and then just, keep on sort of saying, oh, they're that way because of that. Stay curious.
Absolutely. You gotta have an open mind, explore the options, and look. Best case scenario, there's no change. Worst case scenario, there's no change.
Yeah.
Best case scenario, your whole lives change. For me, it repaired the relationship that I had with my son. It repaired, parenting that actually was traumatic for me, because I felt so helpless and powerless to know how to support my son when he would be the one crying, going, Mummy, I don't want to be a naughty bad boy. I'm not even in control of my body. I don't mean to do that. I don't want to do this. And that was really, really scary and hard for me as his mum. So activate psycho mode and put all of my skills and training to good use, and that's how I've hopefully been able to support him the best I can.
We'll love it. All right, that's another one. Everyone, if you enjoy this episode, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe. This is the kind of thing that we do week in, week out, and we look forward to seeing you. Yes.
We do not get paid for this, guys. Something that you can do for free to support us is share this content. Save a link, send it to your friends, tell people about it, because the feedback that we get is it literally is changing people's lives, and it's an amazing resource, and we want to continue doing it, and that is how you can support us to make that possible.
Absolutely. Till next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.